I'm Chad, and today we're going to talk about the roadmaps for IntraWeb 15 through 17. We're going to focus on 17 today, but we are going to talk about 15 and 16. And for the details in 17, we did one presentation already, but we had a problem with the audio. We're going to be doing a new presentation on 17 with more video and demos soon. IntraWeb 15 has been in flux for many years. We're just going to skip the number completely to avoid confusion. And also there was no IntraWeb 13 that we skipped as well. IntraWeb 16 and 17 are both being developed in parallel. The major feature for IntraWeb 16 is Linux deployment. The full roadmap is at the URL seen here. For IntraWeb 16, we want the requirements to be as close to 14 as possible. The IDs will be Delphi, C++ 2009, or maybe 2010 and higher. And the browser should be the same policy as 14, which is roughly tip -1. The goals of IntraWeb 16 are to be enticing yet timely. Currently we're targeting possibly August 2017, and we anticipate IntraWeb 16 to be 100% backwards compatible or possibly requiring only very, very minimal changes. The goal is to take your code and run it in IntraWeb 16 as quickly as possible. The features, as we discussed before, the major feature is Linux deployment. We also plan to have native Apache support on both Windows and Linux. As it is currently, you can deploy under Apache on Windows, but there are some side effects and so there are some extra features you need to take. So the native Apache support will help that significantly. We also want to introduce additional IDE integration, as we've done on Crosstalk, and you can see here Crosstalk has its own menu within the IDE, and we plan to do the same for IntraWeb. The goals for IntraWeb 17. IntraWeb 17 I've just codenamed Blue Shift. The goal is to have Big Bang. Bring IntraWeb back, not just to the front of web development, but far, far ahead of everyone else. Those of you who have been with IntraWeb for a long time remember that we had something called partial for many, many years before Ajax. And it did the same sorts of things Ajax did. It updated partial parts of pages without having to refresh them all or send everything back to the server. And we have a lot of technology we've been developing over the years that we're now rolling out into 17. We also plan for 17 to be highly compatible via what's called page 16 mode, which we're going to talk about soon. IntraWeb 17 is going to have, of course, everything IntraWeb 16 has: Linux, native Apache deployment, and IDE integration. We plan, therefore, for the rest of the features to be released in phases. Currently, 7.0, we're planning to have the new TypeScript libraries, IWML, which is the core feature of IntraWeb 17, Dialogs, and possibly the unified libraries, although they may wait until 7.1 or later. From 7.1 on, we're looking at Server Manager, WordPress integration, Facebook integration, and a feature we called Modal, which we'll touch upon a little bit later. For the TypeScript library, currently in IntraWeb, there is a lot of Delphi code, and there is some JavaScript code that runs in the browser. And the JavaScript code we internally call IWCL, or the IntraWeb Component Library. Currently, that's all JavaScript. For 17, we are redoing everything in TypeScript, and this wraps around the IWML functionality. However, IntraWeb 17 will also contain something called page 16 mode, which will let you run all of your IntraWeb 14 and 16 code pretty much unchanged or very close to unchanged. So the goal would be, again, similar to IntraWeb 16 with IntraWeb 17, is that you can take your code, bring it in, and with few or no changes, get your code up and running very, very quickly. We want people to be able to move forward. In page 16 mode, you'll be using the same IWCL, which is written in JavaScript. So why TypeScript? Well, we like to say that JavaScript is the Vogon poetry of code. It's a really horribly designed language, and the only reason people use it is it's pretty much the only language that the browsers understand. However, many people have come up with solutions to help work around this a bit, and one is Anders Heilsberg's answer, which is called TypeScript. Anders, most of you should recognize, he's known as the father of Delphi and .NET. So TypeScript might think of as JavaScript done right. It's kind of a cross between JavaScript and C#, and it has a lot of features that are similar and I'm sure inspired by Delphi as well. It transpiles or cross-compiles into JavaScript. So the TypeScript compiler actually takes TypeScript files and outputs JavaScript files. But one big difference is many cross-compilers cannot debug at their own source level. So you end up debugging in JavaScript instead of their own language, which is a real productivity killer. With TypeScript, you can actually debug at the TypeScript level. You don't debug at the JavaScript level. And it fully integrates with JavaScript and vice versa. JavaScript can call TypeScript libraries and TypeScript libraries can use JavaScript libraries. To edit TypeScript, you can use any text editor, Notepad. You could even use the Delphi IDE. You can use VisualStudio.net, but we actually don't recommend it because VisualStudio.net is so heavy and 90% of the stuff in there doesn't apply to TypeScript. But even worse yet is it's 2 versions behind for TypeScript. So if you want to do it in VisualStudio.net, you can't use the latest version of TypeScript. You need to be 2 minor versions behind because the tooling lags behind. There's another product called Visual Studio Code, which is free. It's a lightweight IDE, which supports a lot of languages, and one of them is TypeScript. And I really, really like Visual Studio Code. And even if VisualStudio.net was up to speed, I would still use Visual Studio Code for TypeScript, as I just find that it fits a whole lot better. It's free, it's really the best option, and it's also cross-platform, so it runs on other platforms besides Windows. Don't panic, we have plenty of towels. I got a lot of feedback last time, everybody saying, oh, you're going to break all of our code. No, that's not the goal. Okay, we need to move forward. So we're going to need to come up with a new framework. We can't continue to run in the same framework, which was designed for early versions of Internet Explorer and Firefox 4 and just has continued to evolve over the years. We've really long since reached the limit of that framework. We need to move to a new framework. So what we're doing is called IWML, but this runs side by side with page 16. So that means you can bring in your application into IntraWeb 17 pretty much as is, and it should run with minor or no changes. And then moving forward, you can say, well, my new forms I'm going to develop in IWML, or individual forms I'm going to port over to IWML. But there's no forced movement. You can still even develop new forms in page 16, just as you always have. And the IWML forms, they act very similar. So if you know how to do existing intro pages, you code them in a very similar manner. But the components and the classes are different. So IWML stands for the IntraWeb Markup Language. Formerly we referred to this as page 17, which we're not going to use anymore. It is now IWML. It is not backwards compatible, but remember it can run side by side. There are new controls and new pages. The biggest effect is going to be to control authors, and there's simply no way that we can make the old controls run in the new framework. It really just is not possible. It would be like trying to make Commodore 64 games run easily within a WPF application. Sure, you could come up with virtualization or something, but it's just really not meant to do that. You couldn't take individual pieces of it and drop them on. So we really need to move to a new framework if we're really going to move forward with IntraWeb. So we also have IWCL, which is the IntraWeb Component Library, which is what internally we use to refer to the code that we have that runs in the browser. So we still have the page 16 IWCL, which is a JavaScript to run page 16 code. But the IWML one now is all based on the browser or DOM level because it runs in TypeScript. So you might think of IWCL or IWML as a component library for the browser, or as some people have said, like a WPF or XAML for the web. Short summary would be that the DFMs are replaced by the IWM file. So instead of storing it as the Delphi form format file, which isn't really tuned to web development, it works fine. But by switching to IWML, we become more domain specific, more portable, and we can render the files directly in the browser. The HTML and CSS rendering now occurs on the client instead of the server. This really simplifies our code because we're able to directly manipulate the DOM rather than having to construct HTML and CSS as a big string. This also reduces the server CPU load, the RAM load, and the bandwidth. Not just a little bit, but significantly in all 3 of these because it's moving the processing down into the browser. And it's not significant when you have 1 user. So it's not going to eat up a lot of CPU on the client either, and even low-end machines are able to run this. But if you have 1,000 users, you've now removed 1,000 user processing off the server into the client. So it's a much more distributed design. It also drastically simplifies testing of the components. So the current flow, or as page 16 mode is in 17, is the designer interacts with the DFM. This is a streaming file. And then the server converts the DFM to HTML and CSS on each page request and then sends that to the browser. With IWML, the IWML file is where the designer streams and stores the page at. And instead of translating it into HTML, CSS in the server, it just sends the IWML file straight to the browser. And the TypeScript in the browser, the IWCL, then translates it in the browser to HTML and CSS. Now the future we're looking at is well beyond Delphi. Delphi is our primary flagship. In the past we did have a .NET version and we even had a Java version, both of them a little over 10 years ago. And at the time, the markets were quite a bit different. Those developers at the time typically did not buy stuff from third parties unless they were really big names, or Microsoft or Sun. It was almost the IBM mentality. You stuck with Big Blue or Microsoft or Sun, whoever it was, and you really didn't buy third parties. Now the ecosystem has changed significantly in the last 12 or 13 years since we had those products. But still, we have a lot of Delphi code. By moving to TypeScript, it makes it a lot easier for us to support even things such as Lazarus. We constantly get questions, when are you going to support Lazarus or Free Pascal? And we have looked at it. But the code, especially the design code, was a fair amount, and it was significant enough that it really didn't make sense to invest in it from a financial standpoint. But by moving a lot of the code to TypeScript, that reduces the amount of code we have that's specific to Delphi, and mostly around the designers and those sorts of things. And even that code can be changed. So we're definitely reevaluating Lazarus again, as well as standalone packages, a JavaScript, TypeScript version, a .NET version, Python, PHP, etc. But Delphi is going to be our primary. We're not going to let any of these distract from our flagship product. More information on IntraWeb 17. We'll discuss a little bit more, but there will be a more in-depth IntraWeb 17 presentation coming very soon. We did release one several days ago. There was a problem with the audio where the microphone turned off at the 15-minute mark, and in fact we had to re-record this particular presentation a second time as well, but we believe we have that problem fixed now. So Dialogs. Some of the other features in IntraWeb 17 would be realistic desktop type dialogues. There are the old JavaScript alert ones, but the problem is they tend to block all pages in the browser. If any page pops up a dialog, in most of the browsers, it blocks all the pages within that browser. And sometimes they even end up behind the browser and users don't know to bring them to the front. They're basically really problematic. The other way is to pop up frames within each page, and many users do that, or there are third-party dialogues that do that, but we really want to take it to the next level and build it in as a framework level, and not just simple message boxes or alerts, but full text input, multiple choice selections, yes, no, these types of dialogues. A unified library, right now we have, if you want to deploy as ISAPI, you need a different library type than a standalone, and generally people pick one, but standalone can be much easier to debug. So a lot of people debug in standalone, then they switch to ISAPI, and you have to have two projects or convert the project types. We want to come up with a unified library where you pick one type of project, and then there will be libraries or level of indirections which will allow you to deploy on ISAPI, Apache, or standalone. In fact, we already have this with ASP.NET. It has a stub that loads the other files, so we'll be extending this so that you'll have one project type. Server Manager, this is something that's actually been on the list for a very long time, and this won't come till at least 7.1. But the idea is that optionally your applications could run under another layer of indirection, and this layer of indirection would allow you to do many things on your server, such as monitor the application, see their stats, whether to take them online, offline, enter maintenance mode, control the RAM and disk bandwidth, or other custom information that your application could feedback. And the same thing for users, see their session time, how many users there are, the RAM bandwidth usage, custom information about the users, as well as being able to message individual users, kick them off, or do upgrades. For instance, stage live upgrades. Let's say you want to do an upgrade, but you still have 5 users logged in. Typically, you either have to kick them off or do an upgrade in the middle of the night or force some users off, and it can be really problematic. So by using staged upgrades, using the Server Manager, you can upload a new version of the application. And what it will do is new users will be routed to the new version. You'll have 2 copies, 2 instances of the same application running at the same time. And then the old users, as they log out, the old application will be shut down when the last user logs out, and then it can be deleted. And then as they log back in, they can come into the new application. Also making upgrades a lot easier. Instead of having to have you log into the server and upgrade via FTP or remote desktop or whatever method it is you use, you're able to upgrade directly through the Server Manager by logging in and saying, I want to upgrade this application. You upload the files and it will do the transitions for you into the new instance of it. WordPress controls. WordPress right now is used in something like over half the websites in the world. It's a really big package. WordPress is more of a content management type system though. It doesn't compete with IntraWeb at all. But there are a lot of areas that we certainly want to integrate with it. The features are not firmed exactly what we're going to do, but certainly we want to be able to serve IWML pages within WordPress, both static and content, still static and dynamic, sorry. User integration, so a user could log into WordPress and they wouldn't have to re-log into your WordPress application. You could just use the information from that logged in user already. The ability to merge WordPress and IntraWeb output, that is, certain WordPress pages could be served by IntraWeb directly. And the ability to merge into WordPress templates. So that way your IntraWeb application could run within a WordPress site and the user would still see the same style and with all the extra functionality being provided by WordPress, such as its menus and those sorts of applications. But within that, an actual IntraWeb application. And the same types of things for Facebook, but Facebook, of course, is not the same as WordPress, so the features would be different. But again, looking at user integration, the ability to post on walls, and the ability to deploy an IntraWeb application as a Facebook application. Now, there's something called, it's just simply called Modal for lack of a better name, and this is also something I've been looking at for a very, very long time. One thing that throws a lot of developers off is that when they come to a web application versus a desktop application, they're used to being able to block for input in some cases. In other words, I show a modal dialog and the code stops until I receive an input or the user closes it. And with web applications, because of how they're built, this just typically is impossible. And there are ways to do this. The best way would be fibers. They're lightweight, and we actually did some work around fibers in Indy over actually about 15 years ago. The issue moving forward with fibers is different support in different operating systems, and there are some side effects. So we may look at fibers again. But the bigger issue with fibers is the IDEs tend to really freak out, especially some of the Delphi IDEs, but not only Delphi, Visual Studio as well, because the IDEs and debuggers don't have built-in specific support for fibers. So when they see a fiber, they get kind of confused. Some of them, sometimes they think it's a thread, sometimes they don't know what's going on at all, but it really creates some debugging issues. So we may look at using fibers again. This may be a feature that's only available in newer IDEs, or in the older IDEs it may just be optional and cause some debugging issues. Or it may use stalled threads. The issue with a stalled thread is it could impact performance, but again, this would be an optional feature, and it would certainly make coding a lot easier in many scenarios. The requirements of the IDE, we're definitely going to move this on up. Currently, IntraWeb 14 supports 13 compilers plus a C++ personality for each. That's 26 variants if we just count compilers alone. This doesn't even take into account the browsers and the versions, the client OS, server OS, and the hosting method. If you take all of these and put these together, we have several thousand different combinations that need tested against, which is of course impossible. There's no way we can do 5,000 different tests, especially which would require virtualization of operating systems. So we do the testing the best we can, but where it really hits us is when we get specific bugs. It's very frequent for some user to say, I have this version of Firefox and this server operating system and this client operating system with this compiler, and then we have to go reconstruct this build environment when it can't be reproduced in other environments. And this is a huge resource drain for our team. So we really need to bring this down a little bit. We've started to collect analytics, which I'll show some graphs of this soon, and we'll talk about which IDEs we plan to support. The final decision won't be made until we get closer to release, but we certainly want to carry along most of our users. So the users who will be affected by this will be very, very few. Little used IDEs to be removed. Absolutely. So the IDE usage of IntraWeb 14 prior to the release of 10.2 Tokyo. This was February 2017. As you can see how it's distributed. If we were to cut out 2010 and XE and just go from XE2 forward, we would get 99% of our users. More likely scenario though is from XE5 forward. This would cover 96% of our users. Now even if you say this, you're going to exclude 4% of your users. Well, in some cases, yes, but we're still going to be supporting IntraWeb 16. So IntraWeb 16 is not going to go anywhere. These users can stay in IntraWeb 16, and we will continue to take IntraWeb 16 forward with bugs in maintenance mode. But really, if you're going to be developing and you want to be on the leading edge, you're going to have to come forward at least a little bit with us. XE5 is several years old. So XE5, I don't remember the exact year it came out, but even if it's 5 years ago, we don't think it's unreasonable to say that you have to be an IDE that's at least within the last 5 years. We think that's more than fair. So the final decision, again, will come from user feedback. But if we were to make the decision based on these numbers, it would probably be XE5 forward. But potentially it could go up, at that right now. If we went XE7 forward, we could cover 90%. And maybe by the time that IntraWeb 17 is ready, maybe more users will have moved to XE7 or XE8, and we'll look at the numbers again at that time. So the requirements in the browser, it's the same basic policy as 14, roughly tip -1. Chrome and Firefox users are almost always on tip versions because of the aggressive auto upgrade that both of those products have. If today, possibly, it would be Chrome 43+, Firefox 45+, IE 11. This is a huge problem for us because we understand, especially some corporate users, they have a corporate policy of using IE, but IE is a living nightmare, not just from a bug standpoint, but the versions that are out there. It doesn't auto-upgrade as aggressively as Chrome and Firefox. It goes through system updates, many of which people have disabled, especially on pirate Windows. People typically disable the updates because they're worried about some of the updates, bricking or disabling or turning on notifications for their pirated version of Windows, and that's how the latest WannaCry really went around. It really hit XP and unpatched 7s of pirate copies. So IE is a consistent problem for us. And then of course there's Edge, which is Microsoft's replacement for Internet Explorer, but the problem is Edge is only available for Windows 10 forward, and that doesn't really help the Windows 7 and other users that are still out there. Edge 13, possibly 15. Edge is an incomplete product as well. The problem is the shipping version of Edge. I mean, there are many things missing from it. Fortunately, they're really focusing on HTML compliance. So even the existing versions of Edge, we've been pleasantly surprised with how they do with modern code. Some of the legacy code still is an issue, but we're going to be a little more optimistic about Edge than we previously were. Safari 10. And the mobiles. Mobile is very important, and IWML has a responsive layout, which many people will be happy to hear. So we're definitely going to be a lot better on the mobiles moving forward. The issue is the stock browsers in the mobiles are really horrible. And there isn't even just one stock browser, because the different versions of Androids have different versions of the Android stock browsers. And of course on Apple, they have their own stock browsers, and they're horrible. They're missing so many features. So we're certainly going to evaluate that, but it may have the requirement that the users may have to use the mobile versions of Chrome or Firefox. But this is true for many websites. There are many websites and applications that absolutely just don't work in the stock browsers. Because unless you're going to dumb yourself down to basic HTML4 or HTML5 without a lot of the extras, just a lot of them don't work. And this isn't even counting the bugs. And because so many people use mobile Chrome or Firefox, the vendors just don't really seem to care about the stock browsers. Stock browser seems to be there like the old IE4. It's only there so you can download, Firefox or Chrome. Older browsers and older OSes, as of April 2017, Windows 7 has almost 50% of the share. Now, where this comes into importance is that Edge is not available on Windows 7. It's only on Windows 10 forward. And for those corporate customers, that puts an IE requirement in there sometimes. Right now, XP is only about 7%, and their max IE is 8. So if you still have XP users, the answer for IntraWeb 17 is probably going to be use Firefox or Chrome. But at that point, you're looking at a 17-year-old OS anyways. So if you really have to support all these users, and for some reason they can't go to Firefox or Chrome, you're probably going to have to stay with IntraWeb 16. And there's not much we can do about that. I mean, at this point, supporting Windows XP with Internet Explorer at some point is going to be like asking us to support Windows 95 or Windows 3.1. It's too old. We're still going to be supporting IntraWeb 16, so we're not abandoning anyone. But if you want to move forward, you're going to have to help us a little bit. Vista, the max IE is 9, but Vista usage is tiny. Windows 7 pretty much killed Vista. It's less than 1%. Windows 7, of course, is a big component there. So Windows 7, we're not going to be dropping support for that, of course, anytime soon. And even XP is still there. Just users may have to use Firefox or Chrome. Windows 10 is gaining, and we expect this to continue as PC sales continue into the future. A lot of people say I'm lost. Well, remember this. IntraWeb 16 continued support post IW17 release. We have 14 out, and we still support IntraWeb 12. We have still released new IntraWeb 12 releases as needed for bug fixes. The difference is, once IntraWeb 16 is out and then IntraWeb 17 comes out, we're not going to be putting new features into IntraWeb 16 except very minor ones. It's going to be focused on bug fixes. But IntraWeb 16 will be there in case you need to deal still with the older browsers, etc. But the other thing to remember is that IntraWeb 17, the page 16 mode isn't going to change. So you could still move into IntraWeb 17 and use page 16 mode to reach those older browsers if you really have old customers who can't run the newer stuff. And the same thing for older IDs. If you're in an older ID that we're going to drop 2010 or something, you can still use IntraWeb 16. IntraWeb 17, you only need to, the IWML, you only need to switch over to use the new features. IntraWeb 17, the full roadmap is at this URL. And as I said, there is a second IntraWeb 17 presentation coming where I'll be showing some videos of the demos, etc. The ETA at earliest to be late 2017. The majority of the work, the hardest part has already been done for IntraWeb 17, but there's a lot of quantity left. We have built the proof of concept. We know that it works, but we don't have a lot of controls yet. Right now there's 4 or 5 layouts and there's maybe 3 or 4 controls. We need to go back and re-implement all of the existing IntraWeb controls. And then there's a whole lot of other controls we've had planned for a long time. So another advantage with IntraWeb 17 is you're going to see a lot of new controls, a lot of things that people have been asking for, and a lot of controls that are far more advanced than the controls we've had before. And yes, we're looking at wrapping jQuery UI and a lot of those things as well. But the problem with a lot of those controls is they really work down at the low level, DOM level of JavaScript. And some of them, in some cases, it's going to be easier to re-implement them rather than wrap them. In other cases, we will be able to wrap them. And this is because they play at the very low level. Whereas IWML, it would be like writing a Delphi desktop application. But when you want to change the button, instead of changing the button, you had to go to the canvas and redraw the button yourself. And that's really what working with JavaScript and even jQuery and a lot of the others are. You're still working at that low level. With IWC and IWML, you're working up at the component level. So we'll wrap them as we can, but in all cases, it may not be easily done. More details. IntraWeb 17 extremely preview. This was only posted on May 21st. There is an audio problem from the 15-minute mark. We finally solved this. We found there's a feature on the wireless microphone we're using that turns off at 15 minutes if you're not using the headset part. So if you're only using the microphone, it turns off. We were able to find a tweak to fix this, so we shouldn't have this problem anymore. But there's another presentation coming. It'll be a redo of the same presentation, but we'll be adding new demos. We'll be adding in video of the demos as well, rather than just the screenshots. And I hope to have that later in the week. Thank you for your time.